Disclaimer: The Force is strong with J.K. Rowling. They made their way to King's Cross the next morning on foot with a guard of Order members. That bit was just for Harry, which he took about as well as most of them expected. They were running late because Sturgis Podmore had failed to show up, and once they got on board, Ron had to go to the prefects' meeting at once. Hermione, Harry, and Ginny soon found themselves a compartment with Neville and Luna. Hermione had to explain why she was back at Hogwarts, but they were both pleased to see her. She made a note to talk to Luna about potential magical weapons in private later. At least that bit of work would be streamlined. "I'm surprised the two of you aren't prefects," Neville told Harry and Hermione. "Ron and Parvati are all right, but they don't really seem like—" "I know," Hermione said. "I probably won't be here for spring term, though, and Harry, we're not really sure what happened with him." "Dumbledore doesn't like me this year," he muttered. "I'm sure he doesn't," Ginny reassured him, patting his arm. "You're one of the few people who's still on his side. I think the stress is getting to him." Harry gave a disagreeable sort of grunt, but said nothing. "It is odd," Hermione agreed. "I know you'd be a controversial choice, what with what the Prophet's been writing all summer, but Professor Dumbledore certainly hasn't been shy about inviting controversy." "The Daily Prophet has clearly been infested with Raxperts," Luna said over her upside-down copy of the Quibbler. Sure. And Dumbledore can't possibly think you're not prefect material after all you've done, Harry. I mean, just look at last night." "What happened last night?" asked Neville. Hermione glanced at Ginny and let her tell it. "It had happened just as everyone was going to bed. Hermione was changing into her pajamas when she heard a faint sobbing sound, which concerned her some, but it wasn't until she heard Harry shout, 'Expecto Patronum,' that she became alarmed. Fearing for the worst, Hermione moved faster than I had ever seen her before, threw on a bathrobe over her underwear as she banged through the door, flew down the stairs, and charged into the drawing-room with her own shout of 'Expecto Patronum.' Her Otter Patronus appeared at once, where it immediately joined Harry's stag in trampling a Dementor into submission." Back up, I've got it!" Remus yelled as he rushed into the room. He jumped in front of Harry, and the Dementor turned into a silver orb. "Ridiculous!" he bellowed, and the orb turned into a balloon and flew out the window. Hermione turned pink as she realized the threat was actually the boggart from the writing desk, not a real Dementor. She turned around and saw a tear-stricken Mrs. Weasley staring up at her and Harry in awe. Without even consciously commanding it, her Patronus swam over to her and nuzzled her cheek, and the older witch started to calm down. It wasn't hard to guess what a mother of 7, who had already lost a family to war, would see in a boggart. Hermione hadn't heard all the details, but she knew that Harry had found Mrs. Weasley and jumped between her and the boggart when her own ridiculous failed. Mrs. Weasley had thanked both Harry and Hermione when she came to her senses, and everyone was impressed with their Patronuses. Mad-Eye Moody even complimented them for their quick thinking. Courage, chivalry, quickness to action, and magical talent. All great traits for prefects, and Gryffindor ones in particular. And that certainly wasn't the first or most significant time Harry had shown those traits. "I don't know why Professor Dumbledore didn't pick you, but it certainly wasn't because you're not good enough, Harry," Hermione concluded. "And I agree," Ginny said. "Thanks, girls," Harry said, but he still looked unhappy. Hermione didn't blame him. Dumbledore was being more mysterious than usual this summer. She was pretty sure he was hiding something, the same way he didn't want Harry informed of what was going on at headquarters, but it didn't look like he was any more likely to tell her his reasoning than Harry. And it was doubly mysterious because the heads of house were supposed to have some input into the selection, and Professor McGonagall seemed even less likely to pass Harry over. Ron came back about an hour into the trip and reported that he'd traded with Padma so that she and Parvati could patrol the train together. The other new Ravenclaw prefect was Anthony Goldstein. It was Ernie Macmillan and Hannah Abbott for Hufflepuff, and, unfortunately, Draco Malfoy and Pansy Parkinson for Slytherin. That was definitely Snape's influence, Hermione thought. Theo Knott and Daphne Greenglass would definitely have been better choices. But Cedric was head boy and Rebecca was head girl, so that was good. Malfoy showed up to annoy them at one point, but he didn't cause too much trouble. Once they got to Hogwarts, they got a new surprise. Hagrid wasn't there. A witch with a prominent chin and a severe haircut was escorting the first years to the castle. Parvati informed Hermione that she was Professor Grubbly-Plank, who had substituted for Hagrid briefly last year. No one knew where Hagrid was, but they didn't have time to ask around. They climbed aboard the Thestral-drawn carriages and rolled up to the castle. The great hall was already filling up when they arrived. Hermione's eyes immediately sought out Septima, who was sitting at the end of the high table, as usual. She waved back when Hermione waved at her, but she looked less happy than she had last year. "It's that Umbridge woman," Harry hissed. "Who?" Hermione looked around. Harry pointed at a short, squat witch sitting beside Professor Dumbledore. She had a toad-like face and wore a hideous pink cardigan with a matching pink Alice band in her curly, mousy hair. "She was at my hearing. She works for Fudge." "She works for Fudge? Why would she be... Oh, dear." "What?" Harry said. Hermione scanned the high table and counted the familiar faces. 14, plus McGonagall, Filch, and that Grubbly-Plank woman made 17, and the only remaining post left unaccounted for was the Defense Against the Dark Arts post. "No, surely not." "What is it?" Ginny asked. Hermione leaned close and dropped her voice to a whisper. "Professor McGonagall said she was worried the Ministry would interfere at Hogwarts this year. I think they chose the defense professor." Ginny's eyebrows shot up. "Can they do that?" she asked. "Legally, I don't know, but I think they did. Did any of you read any of the new defense textbooks yet?" "Did anyone besides you, Hermione?" George asked. She ignored that. "It's horrid. It's all about avoiding a fight and how you should only use defensive spells instead of fighting back. The third years probably know more practical defense than what's in that book." "But why would they send such a bad teacher?" asked Fred. "I don't know." Their conversation was interrupted as Professor McGonagall led the first years into the Great Hall. It was another big class, born in the first years after Voldemort's previous defeat. There were also several older students at the back of the line. Those must be the students who were forced out of homeschooling to attend Hogwarts, Hermione thought. None of them looked all that happy to be there. The Sorting Hat's song was different this year. It was twice as long as the ones Hermione had heard before, and instead of extolling the virtues of the four houses, it told the history of their split early in Hogwarts history. Hermione's frown deepened as she heard the tale. She knew that Slytherin had left early in the school's history because of the dispute over his pureblood prejudices, but what she hadn't heard was that never in the ensuing 1,000 years had the four houses been united. According to the hat, something always came between them. Probably still the pureblood prejudices most of the time. Some of the hat's closing words truly chilled her. "Though condemned I am to split you, still I worry that it's wrong. Though I must fulfill my duty and quarter every year, still I wonder whether sorting may not bring the end I fear." Were the divisions at Hogwarts so deep that the whole school could collapse under their weight? Was the sorting a mistake from the start? What did this portend for the war? She had no idea, but the hat had 1,000 years of experience, and its advice wasn't to be taken lightly. Many of her fellow students looked worried too. "The hat gives warnings to the school when it detects periods of great danger," said Nearly Headless Nick, the Gryffindor ghost. "It must think something very serious is happening." That much she was sure of, but the rest? Well, Hermione would just have to wait and see. Professor McGonagall called the roll, and the first years were sorted, from Ewan Abercrombie to Rose Zeller. But when they were done, Hermione didn't take the hat away, as she usually did, and there were still half a dozen students standing in the middle of the hall. "Congratulations to all of the first years," Professor McGonagall said. "However, we are not quite done. Due to the new educational regulations from the Ministry this year," she shot an annoyed look at the newcomer at the high table, "we have 6 transfer students from homeschooling and tutoring programs and 1 from Beauxbatons. I invite these students to also step forward when I call your names." Hermione was still trying to figure out whether someone had miscounted when McGonagall called the 4th name. "Granger, Hermione." There were surprised whispers throughout the hall, and Hermione stood up. "Excuse me, Professor?" "Miss Granger, please come forward." "But, Professor McGonagall, I've already been sorted. I'm a Gryffindor." "Yes, you were sorted 4 years ago, but technically your Gryffindor affiliation was cancelled when you transferred to Beauxbatons. Since you have re-enrolled here, you need to be re-sorted. It is an eventuality that has not happened in my lifetime, but the rules do require it." "Oh, okay, Professor." Hermione suddenly felt very self-conscious as she walked to the stool like a little firstie. What if she was sorted into a different house? Could she be sorted into a different house? She had already bought her Gryffindor robes, not to mention all the other problems with that. She sat on the stool and placed the hat on her head. It must have been magically enlarged at some point because it still covered her eyes. Hello, Mr. Hat," she whispered. "Hello again, Miss Granger," the hat's voice whispered in her ear. "It's not often I get to talk to a student more than once. You've certainly grown since I last spoke to you." "It's good to talk with you again, too, I suppose," she said. Even after 4 years, it didn't feel any less strange to be having a conversation with an article of clothing. "I really wasn't expecting this." "Ah, but it's my pleasure. I haven't done a resorting in 100 years. It's always interesting to see what's changed." "Aren't you going to just send me back to Gryffindor, though?" "Please say yes. Please say yes." "I don't have to send you there, Miss Granger, and I almost never have this much material to work with." "What do you mean?" she said, nervously. "I've often thought we sort too soon at Hogwarts. Dumbledore's expressed the same sentiments a few times. People change even by their 2nd year, let alone their 7th. And you, by virtue of age and experience, have the qualities of all 4 houses in greater quantity than many of the first years have any of them." Hermione goggled at that. She couldn't imagine herself being one of those, presumably, rare people who were balanced amongst all the houses. "But I must have a dominant aspect to my personality," she argued. The Sorting Hat actually started to laugh. She could imagine her friends seeing its tip quivering and wondering what it was talking about. Everyone must be wondering what was taking so long. They had already gone longer than her first sorting. "My dear," it said, "the dominant aspect of your personality is, and always has been, Ravenclaw. But that's not the only reason I sort children where I do. It's not all about being around people who are like you. It's about putting you in the place that will suit you best, and hopefully where you can do the most good for the school. Do you remember why I sorted you into Gryffindor before, Miss Granger?" "You said Ravenclaw wasn't what I needed," she recalled. "You said I had, well, it must have been some kind of Gryffindorness that needed to be cultivated." "Precisely. You would have been a brilliant Ravenclaw, but if I had sent you there, you would have always been a shy, rule-abiding number-file with few close friends, living a fairly uninteresting life. You might have still found the 6th exemption to Gamp's Law, but you never would have started smelting metals, making magical maps, or casting left-handed. In fact, I doubt whether you would have been adventurous enough to befriend the House Elves. But instead I sent you to Gryffindor, and it's done you a world of good. Gryffindor has taught you to loosen up and think outside the box. And as a result, it's enriched your life beyond what you could have imagined 4 years ago." "And nearly got me killed 4 times, but fair enough," Hermione quipped. "So what's the problem?" "Simply that you've already learnt the lesson that you needed to learn from Gryffindor. You have daring, nerve, and chivalry that would make old Godric proud. You have friendships there that won't be broken if you change houses. You have the faculties to be great, no matter where you go. You don't need Gryffindor now any more than you need Ravenclaw." "Well, I have to go somewhere, Mr. Hat." "So cheeky, Miss Granger. Yes, you have to go somewhere, but the where is not so clear. This is a very rare privilege for you, and it shouldn't be wasted." "So what are you thinking? Aren't you supposed to be sorting me, after all?" The Hat laughed again. "What do you think I've been doing while we're talking all this time? There's a lot more to look through in your head than there was last time." "That's a little creepy, you know." That's what all you Muggle-borns say. So I'm left with a conundrum. I could send you back to Gryffindor, and with your history and friendships there is something to be said for that. I could send you to Ravenclaw, your natural fit, but I stand by what I said before. Ravenclaw would be wasted on you. There's also Hufflepuff. Loyalty, justice, hard work, and inclusiveness you already have. You can't befriend the House Elves without being at least a little Hufflepuff. You could do well there, but I honestly don't see much point. You've already learnt the most important lesson you could learn from them. I might have done it to give Hufflepuff House a kick in the pants. They could do well to strive for more. But I think the ordeal their own head boy went through last year will do that well enough. No, they would do well to have you, but they don't need you. But, the Hat continued, there is another option. A place that could benefit you and would benefit from your presence. No. Would you consider Slytherin, Miss Granger? Are you mad? I'd be murdered in my bed, she hissed. The Hat fell silent, but she had the prickling sensation of it giving her the equivalent of a stern look. She could hear whispers building from the tables. Hardly anyone's sorting ever took this long. I just proved your point about the divisions between the houses, didn't I? She asked. What do you think? Okay, not murdered, but I still wouldn't trust Parkinson and Bulstrode not to try something. I really don't think it's a good idea. Think before you dismiss it, Miss Granger. I can see in your mind that you took my warning to heart. Yes, it would take more courage than going back to Gryffindor, but how would it be if a former Gryffindor crossed over to Slytherin? How much good could you do to repair the divisions between the houses simply by being there? Hermione did think about it. It didn't sound completely crazy. There were decent Slytherins out there, even though the loudest of them were disgusting bigots like Malfoy, whose father was an actual Death Eater. At present, though, the Gryffindors and Slytherins wouldn't so much as associate with each other, even if they had been friends before Hogwarts. The prejudices and pressures of the older students ripped apart those fragile first-year friendships before long, and that was the fault of both houses. Having someone who could bear the slings and arrows reach out between them would be something unheard of for a generation at the school, at least to hear the older Gryffindors tell it. But could Hermione be that person? She wasn't so sure. I'm not just any former Gryffindor, though, she said. I'm a Muggle-born, and a close associate of known anti-Voldemort fighters. Neither of those types of people would do very well in Slytherin. So much the better to show your house doesn't define you, the Hat replied. Well, maybe, she said, glossing over the implications of that last line. But do you really think I could make a good Slytherin in the first place? Oh, yes, of that much I am certain, Miss Granger. You have more cunning and ambition than most of the first years I just sorted into that house. Ambition doesn't have to be about power, after all. Your drive to earn a newt in your 4th year and to open up new frontiers of arithmancy is ambition enough. And as for cunning, just as an example, blackmailing Rita Skeeter was a Slytherin scheme if I ever saw one. Her pulse quickened for a moment. I hope what we're discussing will remain confidential, she said. I am magically bound not to reveal student secrets. So... Suddenly, for no apparent reason, there were audible gasps from around the great hall, including Professor McGonagall next to her. What's that about? Hermione wondered. The Hat read her mind and said, We just passed 5 minutes on the stool. I never take more than 5 minutes to sort a student unless they're someone very special. Thanks, I think. So, it repeated, I've demonstrated that you have Slytherin traits, but they're not well developed in you, like the traits of the other houses are. Slytherin still has something useful to teach you. And you have something to teach Slytherin, how to reach out to the other houses, how to be defined by more than their ambition and the purity of their blood. What do you think, Miss Granger? Hermione's pulse started to quicken again. The Hat was really serious. But she did know it took one's preferences into account. Perhaps it could be swayed by logic, too. I can develop my cunning and ambition without being in Slytherin, she said. And I probably will. I'll need it if the war heats up. Isn't that the definition of not being defined by your house? True enough, but what about reaching out to the other houses? I can only do so much good for Slytherin if I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, Mr. Hat. And even if it would be easier to reach out to Slytherin as a Slytherin, even as a Muggle-born, it's going to be hard to reach back out to Gryffindor, since most of them would see me as a traitor. You would still have your friends. I can see in your mind that they are true to you. Even your boyfriend, despite the animosity of his family. Your fellow Slytherins, the better boys and girls among them, would also understand you wanting to maintain your old friendships. I'd still lose the larger support network of Gryffindor House, and I'd have to reach out to both houses at once. The way I see it, it wouldn't be any harder to reach out to Slytherin from Gryffindor anyway. Professor Vector and Georgina are already friendly with me, and there are others who have never given me any trouble, like Greengrass and Davis. I'd rather stay where I am and try to work for the good of the school from there." The Hat was silent for a moment, as if giving her own words time to sink into her mind. "You would do that?" it asked solemnly. "You would reach out to a house you have almost no connections with, against the advice of your friends and the ire of your own house, on the advice of a ratty old hat?" Hermione felt the weight of the words, but they didn't shake her resolve. "Yes, I would," she whispered. "It's the right thing to do." "Then you've chosen your true colors. Gryffindor!" Applause broke out at once, although that might have been more that people were glad she was finally done than actual congratulations. She could hear a few groans, too, likely because people were annoyed that she took so long only to go to the same house. When Professor McGonagall took the hat back from her, she gave her an intrigued look and whispered, "I should very much like to know what that was all about sometime, Miss Granger," before motioning her along. Hermione took her seat again as the other 3 transfer students were sorted quickly, and Dumbledore opened the feast. "It's about time," Ron said as he dug into his food. "What took you so long?" "The Hat kept trying to put me in Slytherin," she said. They laughed, but when she didn't laugh with them, they grew concerned. "Wait, you were serious?" George said. She nodded. "Is it mad? You'd be murdered in your bed." "That's what I said, which was probably a bit hyperbolic, I admit." "But still Slytherin," Fred said, scandalized. "That's insane." "Well, I say good show, Miss Granger," Nearly Headless Nick cut in. "We haven't had a hat stall in ages." "What's a hat stall?" Harry spoke up for the first time. "A sorting that takes longer than 5 minutes, when a student is equally suited to more than one house. They're very rare. If my memory serves, though that was far from a certain thing for a ghost, the last one we had was Professor McGonagall. I might have forgotten one, though." "That would explain why she was so interested," Hermione said. "But that can't be right," George protested. "You can't be equally suited between Gryffindor and Slytherin. You're nothing like a slimy Slytherin." "Slytherins aren't slimy, George. I do have 2 friends who are Slytherins." Fred started coughing and sputtering. "You do?" he said. "Who?" George finished. "Professor Vector and her grandniece, Georgina." "Well, they're all right, I guess." "But you're still nothing like one," Ron said. Hermione sighed. No, it was much more complex than that. The Hat told me my personality has always been Ravenclaw. I'm not a natural Gryffindor or Slytherin, but I do have some traits of both. In fact, most Gryffindors probably have more cunning and ambition than Crabbe and Goyle do." Her friends looked over at Malfoy's goons and laughed. "But why would the Hat want you in Slytherin?" Ginny said, getting back on track. "Basically, it thought it was the house that could help me grow the most." "Yeah, grow into a pompous git," Ron scoffed. She glared at him. "There was more to it than that, Ronald. The Hat also thought that if I switched houses, it would help bridge the divide between them." "You mean trying to get all the houses to be friends?" Harry said, suddenly growing angry and looking back at Malfoy. "Fat chance." Hermione was surprised. Harry had nearly gone to Slytherin himself. "Harry!" she said. "No, I mean it. You've got one friend there, sure, but that's only 'cause she's Vector's grandniece, and she couldn't hate you if she tried. Malfoy practically runs the place over there, and he'd just as soon see us all dead." "I'm sure Malfoy doesn't speak for all of them, Harry. I'd bet there are quite a few Slytherins who don't toe his line, only they're afraid to say it. Maybe if we could connect them with one another, they would." "Yeah, well, I'll believe it when I see it." Hermione frowned. She'd thought her best friend was more open-minded than that. "Well, maybe you will," she said. "I told the Hat I'd try to reach out to Slytherin anyway." "What?" Harry and the Weasleys were aghast. "Hermione, you can't do that," George pleaded with her. "They'll hex you into next week." The others nodded their agreement. "Relax, I'm not going to just walk up and ask them. I'm going to use my Slytherin subtlety, since apparently I have some. I'll ask Septima and Georgina to sound them out." "Oh, well, that's not so bad," he said. "I still think you're little nutters, mind, but only your usual level of nutters." Hermione whacked George in the back of the head, but then she leaned against him affectionately, which was about as much as she could get away with in the Great Hall. After the dinner, Dumbledore made his usual announcements, including introducing Dolores Umbridge as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. But then something happened that horrified most of the Great Hall. Umbridge interrupted Dumbledore. No one said anything, but the shock was palpable. She'd cut in right in the middle of his announcement about Quidditch tryouts. No doubt many of the students were thinking that if Dumbledore weren't under such a thick cloud, they'd be scraping the new teacher off the floor right now. The pink-clad woman cleared her throat with an affected "ahem" sound, and said, "Thank you, Headmaster, for those kind words of welcome," as if she were talking perfectly in turn. Her voice was high and girlish to match her outfit, as if she had never really grown up from being a, no doubt highly disagreeable, little girl. She greeted the school like a bunch of 5-year-olds, and then launched into an alarmingly long political speech. Hermione wished she'd brought her dictaquill with her, but at least she always carried a Muggle mechanical pencil and parchment on her, in case she wanted to do some figuring, so she jotted down notes on Professor Umbridge's main points, lest she miss anything important. What it boiled down to was that the Ministry was allegedly concerned that the students were not taught at Hogwarts in a way that preserved the great traditions of wizarding culture, or some such platitudes. Proper education was to be supported by a balance between old and new, between performance and change, and other such Orwellian doublethink, and she mentioned pruning practices that ought to be prohibited a few too many times for Hermione's liking. To those in the know, it was pretty clear that the ulterior motive was to stop Dumbledore from teaching the school his point of view about Voldemort being back, and, if her brief skim of the defense textbook was any indication, to make absolutely sure he couldn't use the defense classes to foment insurrection against the Ministry. The very thought would have been ludicrous had it not been for the behind-the-scenes information she'd heard from the Order that that was precisely what Fudge feared. This was definitely not a good sign. As they climbed to the dorms, Hermione started to notice that Harry was getting odd looks. Fearful looks, even. She might have thought it was because of his show of power against that dragon last year, but having read the Daily Prophet all summer, she knew better. Harry Potter was mentally unstable, and might go nuts and try to hex you at any moment, thinking you were you-know-who, or something like that. Looking across the hall, Cedric didn't look to be in much better shape. He still walked with a bit of a limp on his wooden leg, and people were giving him a wide berth. He claimed he'd lost his arm and leg to Barty Crouch Jr., and that particular Death Eater was still officially on the loose, but he admitted he was unconscious for most of the encounter. Who knew what really happened? "But Lily, this is Harry Potter we're talking about. You've been saying how great a hero he is yourself for 4 years." Hermione didn't realize she was walking into an argument in her dormitory until she was literally in the middle of it. Her old roommate, Lily Moon, looked almost like a different person from when she'd last seen her. Gone were her irregular braids and relaxed expression. Instead, she had her hair in one long plait down her back, and she looked far more serious than she had last year. Her girlfriend, Sally Ann, was pleading with her to see reason, but she wasn't having it. "I told you what the papers said. Potter's off his rocker. Fainting spells, confusion, headaches. You can't trust what he says. And Dumbledore, he's either getting senile or he's using him." "He is not!" Hermione and Parvati stared at each other as they had said the same thing at the same time. "Dumbledore's the only person Voldemort was ever afraid of," Hermione said. All four of her roommates jumped when she said the name.
He knows him better than anyone. If he and Harry say he's back, I believe them. Hermione, you know who died 14 years ago.
Their remaining roommate, Lavender Brown, jumped into the fray.
Magic can't bring back people from the dead, ever. Voldemort isn't dead, Lavender, Hermione protested. I saw him with my own eyes. He was possessing Quirrell in first year as some kind of dark spirit.
That's impossible, Lavender protested.
Who says so? Come on, Lav, you know Hermione isn't a liar, Parvati said.
Lavender sighed.
No, she's not, but that doesn't mean she saw you-know-who. I don't know what you think you saw, Hermione, but... Quirrell had a second face on the back of his head, Hermione snapped. A face with glowing red eyes and slits for nose. Sound familiar?
All the other girls cringed. Voldemort's appearance was always discussed in hushed tones, if at all, in the wizarding world, but Hermione knew her words would ring true. They had too much of an air of dark magic. Sally Ann was the first to recover.
You see, Lily, she demanded. Hermione knows what she's talking about. Hermione is just trying to scare you, Sally Ann, Lily said. She should be scared, Hermione said. I'm scared, don't you see? We're both Muggleborns. This is the kind of thing we need to be on guard for. But if you and Lavender want to keep on believing the Daily Prophet over people you've personally looked up to for the past 4 years, there's nothing more I can say to you. Oh, come on, it's just one escaped Death Eater. We had scares like this before. No, Sally Ann cut her off. What? Lily said in disbelief. Hermione's right, Lily. I don't believe it's just one escaped Death Eater. Muggleborns know how to spot a propaganda campaign, and that's exactly what the Daily Prophet is turning into. If you want to keep believing them, I don't have anything to say to you. Sally Ann, Lily pleaded, but the Muggle-born girl was already climbing into her bed and closing the curtains. Sally Ann, she repeated, but there was no answer. Unable to get through to her, she despondently climbed into her own bed. Wow, Lavender said. I can't believe she did that. She kind of has a point, Parvati said. What, you too, Pav? Yes, me too, Lav. Honestly, you're the one who kept saying how brilliant Harry is after he fought that dragon. And why would Dumbledore want to discredit Fudge now instead of after the Dementor incident or something? And I'm not very happy about how you're treating Hermione and Sally Ann. Well, they shouldn't be following that loon and... Ekpoximize! Hermione had cast lightning fast and made Lavender's mouth stick closed. You can just keep your big fat mouth shut about my friends, okay? She said. Parvati looked like she wasn't sure whether to be angry or amused. Hermione, you can't just do that in front of a prefect, she said, trying not to laugh. Sorry, finite. You and Pav can hang out with those boys, then, Lavender said indignantly. I'm sure the real truth will come out soon. And she stomped back to her own bed. You won't like it when it does, Hermione muttered under her breath. It's good to see you, Pav. Good night. Good night, Hermione.